Hi, everyone, and welcome back to that UFO podcast. I am delighted to be joined by a returning guest, a historian, researcher, and author of multiple groundbreaking books, even here to discuss his latest work, A History of USOs, Volume 1, Beginnings to 1969. Welcome back to the podcast, Mr. Richard Dolan. Richard, welcome.
Hi, Andy. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Glad to be here.
Good to have you on, and congratulations on the book. For those on YouTube, I'm going to do that thing of holding it up and going. I've got the hardcover here, and we'll get to the various editions of it. But beautiful book, and I know the shout out to the illustrator Alan Levine. Beautifully illustrated cover and the contents inside of it as well. Richard, you must be pleased with the final product.
I'm very happy with this, Andy. It was a lot of work going into it. This was a 3-year project. This including the 2 volumes that are following, which will be following up pretty soon. But yes, it exceeded everything I'd hoped for, to be honest. And you mentioned Alan Levine, the illustrator. He did beautiful illustrations that are throughout that book. The cover actually was directed by Tracy, and we had a different artist, and Alan's in illustrations are inside. But it came out. It was far more than what I set out to accomplish when I began. So I didn't expect to get into the big statistical analysis. I didn't expect a lot of things to come out of it when I started compared with what has happened. So yeah, I'm very happy.
Yeah, well, let's get into it because we've got a lot to cover here, Richard. And I'm going to start off with a really simple but important question because I think I mentioned this to Danny Sheehan just recently. Over the last few months, there has been such a lot of change in the UFO conversation, not to say the least politically in the United States, and we'll get to that later on. There's a lot of new eyes and ears on the UFO topic for a lot of reasons. So people listening to this know what a UFO is, but what is a USO? And why the focus on that particular aspect of the conversation?
Think water UFO, or think water-based UAP. USO stands for Unidentified Submerged Objects. In fact, that's an acronym that's gone through its own little variations over the years, but it's a water-based UFO, to keep it as simple as possible. So an object that is seen operating in an anomalous or an unusual way in the water, in a way that doesn't make sense relating to our technology or what we know exists in the bodies of water, or an object that can enter or emerge from a body of water and act in what we now call transmedium ways. So that is, it can operate as easily in water as it does in air. And that's important because we, as yet, do not officially, and I think probably for real, don't have technology that can do that. Can operate equally well in the water as well as the air. But a lot of these objects, in fact, many of them do, or they seem to, according to the report. So that's a USO. These are things, we're used to talking about UFOs or UAP now in the air, in the atmosphere. We've been hearing a little bit more about these objects in the water. Those are USOs. And that indeed is what these 3 volumes, as they will come out, are all about.
So
it's a history of them.
Yeah, why was it important for you then to focus on USOs? Because there might be some folks thinking, well, if we're aware of transmedium, if these things can operate under the water, in the air, and in the atmosphere and beyond, then aren't they all just the same thing? So why the focus?
Well, it's a great question. And in fact, there have been very, very few books that have focused on this water-based aspect of the phenomenon. It's been very few. In the English language, we didn't get our first one until around 1970, and then it took another 3 decades before we got the second one. So it's been very, very little. And then, Russia has had 1 or 2 books on the subject. The Italian UFO organization has done some work on USOs, and there's been scattered, but it's been very little. But why is it important? I think it's important for no other reason just than because it's so fascinating. I mean, I think inherently speaking, when one hears a story of an object emerging from a body of water and flying off, to me, that is even more fascinating, honestly, than watching hearing a story about a flying saucer that zigzags through the air. That's amazing too. But coming out of the oceans, going into the oceans, you instinctively wonder, what are they doing down there? The ocean is a great big mystery. It's an unknown to this day. I've learned a lot about the oceans in the course of doing this series. So 5% of all of our ocean volume, only 5% has been mapped to any scientific degree. 95% of the volume has not been. The ocean floor, we've done a little bit more. I think we've mapped to a high level of scientific precision, 20, 25%. But that means 75% of the ocean floor remains unmapped in a sophisticated way. So there's a lot that we don't know. And I started this 3 years ago in 2022 for my website, which is richarddolanmembers.com. I have a great community there, and I'll do posts of all different types, video or written articles, whatever. And I just started to do a few on USOs just because, and it became a very interesting little rabbit hole. The members of the site, I think, enjoyed them, and I enjoyed them, and I kept going all through the summer of 2022. I continued this, and the next thing I realized was I've researched. I was doing a lot of research, hunting them down, realizing that all of these great USO cases were scattered in a variety of websites and books and magazines. There was not a single really good available repository of them. And I thought, well, let's see if I can do this. And can I actually can I bang out a history of it? I thought, and it took a little longer than I thought, 3 years, but I went through a lot of different databases, which we can or don't have to go through, but it was meticulous. But for all that, it was fascinating and exciting, and I loved just about every minute of doing it.
The environment we're talking, obviously, with the ocean is incredibly difficult to see anything, to find anything, and that's going to be a big part, I'm sure, of your research. Is how difficult was it to research USOs? You know, it's one thing to go out with a pair of binoculars or a night vision scope and look up at the sky, look at the stars. You can see something, you can see lights and satellites, but to even go and investigate USOs, you could stand next to the water or you could go on a boat. That's about it, isn't it? So how difficult was it researching the book and what you were finding?
Well, I'm a landlubber. I'll say that. I'm not much of a man of the sea. I've been out on the water many times, but I'm not an expert at it. I would never pretend. So what I did, I was simply hunt for stories and reports as they existed. But I think your question, is a really pertinent one. It's like, how often do we actually record these USOs, these types of sightings? Because you often hear researchers sometimes saying things like, oh, at least half of all UFO cases are connected to bodies of water. I've heard this so many times that I've forgotten how many. And honestly, that's just not true. I have not seen that to be the case in my research. It's a minority. In fact, a small minority of cases. When I go through the vast numbers of UFO or UAP cases that are out there, to find one that actually, where you find a craft engaging in some way with a body of water, is rare. It's rare. It's a minority of them, but it's an important subset. And I feel it did deserve and does deserve to be handled, because one of the reasons that I think there are few of them is simply because we're just, as you say, not out on the water. I strongly suspect that there are many more USO cases out there than what we're getting. For these 3 volumes I've collected, 672 of them. Sounds like a lot, but I read probably through 10,000 or so, I'm guessing, prospective cases until I selected these. So, and even those that I selected, I was looking for USO cases. I wasn't just looking at random. So I was very selective, but I do think that there are probably more. There's more going on than we're recording. One good way to see that is I created a map of every USO that I put into this book. So I have Google Earth, and I put little yellow pins on the map to track them. And the large number of these occur near the shore, near some nation's coastline. There are definitely cases that I was able to record where they're out in the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean, but that's much fewer. And of course, you know the old joke, guy's under a street light on the ground on his hands and knees looking for something, and a stranger says, "What are you looking for?" "Oh, my car keys. I lost them." "Oh, okay, well, I'll help you. Where do you think you left them?" "Oh, over there where it's dark, but the light's better here."
Yeah.
So, so I was kind of botched that. But anyway, the idea is that
Yeah.
we're on the shore. We're not out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean
Yeah.
most of the time. So of course we're not going to see them. You do have navies, the US Navy, the Russian Navy, some other navies are out there. The UK Navy has caught some of these out at sea, but they don't like to talk. So it's very difficult to know how much is out there. I believe that there's much more than what I've been able to find. Another reason I think this is, particularly with military cases, a very common way that I would find a military case, because most of those are not through freedom of information. There are a number of the cases I've written about that are fully backed by declassified, usually US government archives, but by some government. But a lot of them are not. But a typical Navy case would be some guy 20, 30, sometimes 40 years after the fact, writing to some online journal or submitting it to the National UFO Reporting Center or someplace like that. And he'll say, yes, back in 1960, whatever, I was aboard this ship and we had this thing happen. And I'm only talking about it now. That is very typical. That's a very, very typical type of a thing. And it's understandable. So I happily include those types of cases. I try to use my best judgment to decide, is this a strong case? Is this not a strong case? I actually created an evidence ranking system for these cases, which I discuss at some length in the book. But, I'm trying to, my number one goal for these, honestly, Andy, was I was aware that there are all of these events. I don't even like to call them cases sometimes because they're encounters that happened to a person or to people. In that first volume that you have there, most of those witnesses are not even alive anymore. But they had an extraordinary thing happen to them that not only are these cases forgotten, in many instances, they've never been remembered to begin with. And I thought, this is terrible. This is not right. I know there's a lot of aerial UFO encounters that have been forgotten just the same. But I thought, well, I could try to do justice to these water-based encounters. That would be a good thing. And I really wanted, more than almost anything else in this book, to just breathe some life into these completely forgotten cases. I think those people who experience them deserve to have their stories told. And these are important events, frankly, if I can say this, in the history of our species and the history of our planet. I mean, when you just stop and think about what I'm trying to describe here, you've got people on a boat, sometimes in an ocean, an object comes out of the water, hovers over their boat, circles around, their electronics go haywire. Once in a while, they're missing some time at the end. The craft goes away. How is that not an extraordinary, incredible occurrence that needs to be preserved? And so that was really my number one goal, to do that and to do it in a way that was worthy of the case or the event itself. And fortunately, I had a wonderful illustrator, Alan Levine, who did just a superb job in illustrating many of these cases.
Yeah, there's some beautiful prints that could come out of some of those pictures as well for your wall in the background. Or how did you decide on how far back to go? Because I think when you're looking at any UFO, USO, UAP case, there are time periods where you can look and think, if it's maybe from the 80s onwards, there's a certain quality of data. You can go back to the 50s and 60s, more paperwork, potentially some grainy video or photographs.
Yes.
After that, it starts to become more testimony based, perhaps some radar data from the kind of World War periods. But then you're going back centuries here where you're truly relying on testimony. And how do you decide, I'm going to stop here? Because even the language used at the time, and I wonder, even when I saw you were going back that far, people talking about, and I hesitate to mention things like this, but I will for a reason, things like mermaids or giant sea monsters. A couple of hundred years ago, people didn't have the terminology for flying saucers, discs, aliens, NHI, UAP. They were just describing something strange in the water. So how did you kind of come to terms of how far back to go?
Great question. I tried to go back as far as the data would allow me. So I looked at, I went back thousands of years and looking for what I thought could be genuine USO cases. Actually did, so the earliest official case that I've included that I have like a case designation for only occurred in 1717, a little more than 300 years ago. And I think that's actually a pretty good case, in fact. But there are earlier potential cases that I do include and I discuss in this book, particularly in the first chapter, which is all dedicated to the idea of ancient USOs. And I really did try to go into it. For example, I did a write-up of the sighting by Christopher Columbus just before he landed in Hispaniola in Santo Domingo, the New World. Because there was Columbus and one member of his crew saw a very unusual light. This is in 1492. And I really try to ask, like, was this a genuine USO or not? And I leave that one open, by the way. I think it's not readily understood conventionally, but it's kind of a vague sighting, and it could be explained by something that they saw on land. It's hard to know. But I looked at earlier cases. There's a number of 10th century, 11th century Chinese cases I discussed. They are potential USO cases. There are a few even earlier. In fact, Alan did a nice rendition of one that took place in Ireland, allegedly, in the year 597. And I wrote about this. I personally don't think that it's a legitimate USO case. The thing about these earlier potential cases is that when you read them carefully, you find a lot of questions about them. In fact, I discussed one that took place in, I think it was Bristol in the 1661, right after the English Civil War. And I have a bit of a conversation about it. And in fact, when you read that case officially, it's like this guy's describing by the River Severn, something that similar to the kites that the young boys fly these days, 1661. So you're thinking angular, you're thinking, oh, it's interesting. It seems mechanical. But then this object took the shape of a man pacing back and forth. And then it took the shape of a man on horseback, galloping back and forth. And then it took the shape of a beautiful woman in a robe of some sort. And to me, this is clearly symbolic, and it very likely had more to do with the end of the English Civil War than any actual sighting. I don't know of what object is going to take the shape of basically Oliver Cromwell and then King Charles and then a woman who's probably a personification of peace or grace or something like that. That's how I read it. So these are not cases that I feel that one can work with. I tried to find them, but I tried to be careful as well. And so the earliest case that struck me as reliable and that I could trust was not until 1717 off the coast of Martinique by a French ship that was in the Caribbean at the time.
You mentioned a couple of things there about potentially objects, what they could be. When it comes to UFOs, there are the typical misidentifications of it's a bird, it's a misidentified aircraft. Nowadays, Starlink satellites, commercial drones, the list goes on, I think. But as you go back further, or even use the environment of water now, what are some of the key misidentifications you think people would come across in your research over the water?
Well, there's a few things. When I'm looking at any case, whether it's a contemporary one or an old case, of course, in the context of USOs, you're looking for things that are truly unusual or hopefully anomalous, things that just don't make sense on the face of it, on the face of the testimony and description. So, for example, there is a case, an early one in that book from 1825, not far from Hawaii, by an English vessel. A really good case, in my opinion. It's a great case because we have the name of the man who recorded it. He was the ship's doctor. His name was Andrew Bloxam. He wrote a detailed journal entry at the time describing what happened on August, I think, 11th of 1825. At 3:30 in the morning, he said, an object described as like a red cannon shot comes out of the water. It's glowing brightly, so bright, he said, you could pick a pin off the deck of the ship at 3:30 a.m. It rises, it's there for a bit, it lowers into the water, and then it does it a second time, rises and lowers into the water twice. So you're left with this. Now, if it was just one time, perhaps you could envision a naturalistic explanation. I don't even know what that would be. What kind of bright, glowing, orangey orb emerges from the ocean for a number of seconds, lighting up your ship brighter than daylight, essentially, and then returning. But to do it twice, we're now relying on the testimony of this man. Do we trust him? That is ultimately the question. Do we trust his authenticity, his reliability? I decide, yes, I think that I do. He was the doctor of the ship. He had ship's logs that were quite extensive, and he writes this one particular entry. That's unusual. So I read that. I think, yes, I'm going to include that. And in fact, I consider it a pretty good case. And also, I look for patterns, or I've come to look for patterns. It so happens that there are a fairly large number of USO cases that are marked by glowing orange-like spherical objects that are seen to emerge from the water or hovering very, very low above the water. It's quite a large number of them. It's a significant subset. So what Andrew Bloxam wrote in his journal of 1825 would fit in quite well with sightings that occurred 150 or more years later.
I was going to ask you just on that, good timing. So you mentioned those orbs within the book. Are there any types of objects or craft that seem to be more exclusive to water than we would find over land or on land? Is there any recurring themes? That's
a fantastic question. No, what I found are the shapes and the types of objects described could be described as any ordinary, I say ordinary, any UFO or UAP. So you get a few different types. Gray, silver, metallic, disc-like objects, flying saucers, were common as USOs. Cigar-shaped objects, which you often get as classic UFOs, these also are USOs, many of them. Orbs or spheres, very common. Particularly when they glow, they're almost all inevitably an orangish type of color. Not always, but predominantly so. Sometimes white, sometimes a few other colors, but orange is quite common. There are a small number of triangular USOs. Just as really, even with aerial sightings, triangles still tend to be somewhat of a minority, although they're a larger minority for aerial sightings. For water-based, the USOs that I have found, and again, I'm only going off of what I have been able to find, they're maybe 5% of the total. They're fairly small, but they are significant because there are remarkable consistencies in these descriptions. So, for example, triangles for USOs are nearly always described as black, which is very common for aerial triangular UFOs as well. So that's a consistent thing. Other types of objects, some are just described only as a source of light. The witness wasn't able to determine if there was a shape or something behind that. It's not unusual. That could be a sphere, that could be a light affixed to some other object of some other shape. There's a lot that we just don't know. But I would say that the USOs are fundamentally not of a different shape than the classic aerial UAP.
So it's safe to say there's a correlation then between the shape and the environment, or there isn't, sorry, because you're seeing them on the same things people are reporting in the atmosphere, in the air, and underwater. So then it begs the question, why that environment? Why the water? For you, is it a question of origin?
Well, it's we're speculating here. You know, why are
Yeah.
they in the water? What is the purpose? And this, I can't say that I know, but I do. I'm happy to speculate about this, and I do as well in this book. The water has. I learned some of this from really listening and talking to Carl Newth, who's an American academician who's talked a little bit about USOs of late. I really like Kevin Newth,
Yeah.
and he stated, he said, you know, there's a lot of advantages to the water. Water, first of all, if you are from elsewhere, water can protect from radiation that may be harmful. Water can protect against rapid temperature fluctuations. It's much more consistent. It will protect against variations of pressure. It will provide an insulating surface in many ways. But also, if you're watching these busy, industrious, smart humans who notice everything, it's a much more secure environment. The humans still haven't really been able to penetrate all parts of the ocean depth. So if you really had the ability to operate down there and you could do it without much of a problem, it could be advantageous in many ways for security. Something that makes sense to me. I actually think, you know, when I study UFO reports, not just USO, but all UFO reports, which I do frequently, I am struck by the fact that they are worldwide every day. And of course, this is not to say that all reported UAP are anomalous alien craft. Of course, I know that's not true, but there's a lot that are very, very anomalous and very difficult to explain, and they happen around the world all the time. To me, that signifies an intelligence that has an interest in this entire world. That suggests to me that they are interested in what we human beings are probably doing, since we are massively important in terms of our effect on this planet. I mean, we have the ability to engage in nuclear war. And even though I'm sure these other beings are well ahead of us in all kinds of technological means, if we were to have a nuclear war, that probably would affect them as well. And so I could imagine they're interested in what we're doing. So therefore, I think ocean-based headquarters activity, that wouldn't surprise me if that's what they are doing.
Your first few words that you started there was, if you are from elsewhere, it would be advantageous potentially. I mean, there's an argument that being from here, it would be advantageous for us to be able to be in the water or have evolved to be under the water. And does that give any credence again to the speculation that potentially these things are from here and they're not using it as a base necessarily? I don't know if that goes back
that they
to
live here.
Atlantean, yeah. We're going into the kind of the abyss type scenario here.
So, yeah, we're getting toward what might be called the Crypto-Terrestrial thesis.
Yeah.
I think I do address this in the conclusion of the book. I actually have a bit of a discourse on it. I think it's in my conclusion. I'm not particularly warm to the idea, but I couldn't rule it out. The idea of a crypto-terrestrial or a kind of independently evolving, let's say, human-like civilization that exists in the water, strictly speaking in the water, I don't know what evidence I could speak to that would attest to it, or even what logic or how that would have happened. I can't say that I'm ruling it out. I could not say that. My assumption is that I'm not really finding many persuasive ancient USO accounts to begin with. I have looked, I have really tried to. When I started this research, I assumed that I would find a couple of decent ancient ones, and I didn't, to my satisfaction. I just did not. There's some pretty good ancient aerial UFO sightings that I find interesting, but I wasn't able to say the same for water-based. So I don't know for a fact that there's even been a long-standing oceanic presence. It's possible. I mean, for most of our history, really up until the 15th, 16th century, human beings were not in the business of crossing the oceans anyway.
Mm.
The Mediterranean Sea was active. The Arabian Sea, that part of the Indian Ocean there, was somewhat active. The South China Sea, a little bit here and there. But the mass of the Atlantic and Pacific and the mass of the Indian Ocean, no. We were not really exploring them or over them to any significant degree. So it's really hard to know. But I'm just not seeing a strong argument to say they have been here all along. They have evolved here. We're now bumping into them. It's possible. At times, when I was writing this book, particularly in some of the chapter introductions, for each chapter, I try to provide a historical context for a lot of the cases. I do speculate, in the 19th and 20th centuries, our society, our species advanced so dramatically with our capability to explore the ocean. It wasn't really until the 1870s, not long ago, that we even started the science of oceanography, of really methodically trying to understand what's down there. So if you were an oceanic presence at that time or earlier, you never had to worry about human beings.
Yeah.
And so I do wonder if there was some kind of operation that was there. They operated securely for eons or for centuries or for however long. Starting in the 20th century, they had to pay attention to us. And so I do speculate along these lines, but I can't say that I know how long anyone's been down there. I think they've been down there for at least a couple of 100 years.
So
I think that.
Thinking of that idea of if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? If there are no human presence, do you believe these objects are even out in the middle of the ocean right now where there are no humans? Do you think then it's more a case that these are observational and they are in a location because we are there?
Yeah, that's another good speculative type of question. And I wonder about this a lot. And I don't have a firm answer, except to say that I think that at least a significant part of what they do probably has to do with us. Some people would say, well, that's ridiculous. Why would you think we're so important? Well, I say that because fundamentally, we're more like them probably than not. We, like them, are capable of abstract thought. We, like them, are capable of scientific thinking. We, like them, are capable of manipulating our environment to suit our needs. We, like them, are capable of destroying the planet. We're capable of doing a lot of things that they can do. Certainly not on their level, but again, they would see us, and I think they would probably recognize that as well. They would say, these humans, they're not like the other animals here. They are active, they're observant, they take notes, they write things down. They'll notice us and react to us if we are here. So hopefully they're thinking, let's not trample all over the garden and wreck their society. Let's play it cool. I like to think that's what they're probably doing. But I do think that we are an interest of theirs, yes.
You mentioned oceanography becoming a thing in the kind of 1870s. As a species, we develop sonar and early versions of it around the early 1900s. The First World War and Second World War have various iterations of this. Is there any evidence you have seen through your research that these objects have changed or adapted their behavior dependent on our technology and detection methods changing?
Yes. In fact, this was something that was rather shocking to me when I began to review the data that I collected for this. So let me just back up and explain that. So in the course of doing this book, when I first started, my intention was simply to just write the stories out as best I could, maybe with some illustrations. But as I got really deep into it, actually, this is a suggestion of my wife, Tracy, where it became very important to this book. She said, it would be really nice if for each of these cases you would have certain basic categories to make it easier for a reader to skim over. What was it, a large object? What was it doing with the water? Was it under the water? Did it emerge from the water? What color was it? How close was the witness to it? And all of these things. And I thought it's a great idea. I didn't want to do it at first because I knew it would be a lot more work, but I ended up going back over every single case and I extracted that data. One of the data points that I included was very simple. Did it happen during daytime or nighttime? It's not always easy to know, like, did it happen at 4 o'clock or 5 p.m. or things like that? But I could, for the most part, determine if it was during daylight or nighttime. And I thought, let's put that in as a factor. And I'm very glad I did, because one thing that I saw very, very dramatically so was how, starting in the late 1960s, sightings went from roughly 50% daytime versus nighttime. Actually, a slight majority up until then were in the daytime. Following the late 1960s, it's almost like flipping a switch, where 3/4 of them ever since have been at night. And there's a further distinction where between military and non-military encounters. So, for example, in that earlier period prior to the late 60s, even though most of the total sightings were in the daytime, military sightings were predominantly at night by a factor of about 2/3, whereas civilian encounters were predominantly in the daytime by a large margin. After 1967, 68, military sightings, I think it's 87 or 88% of all of the military sightings have occurred at night, almost 90%. And also a large majority of civilian ones also at night. So somehow there is a behavioral change in these. And, I mean, you could say, well, you need a bigger data sample. Well, I got 672 of these cases. I mean, it's not a bad data sample. I was simply trying to collect the best USO cases that I could find. That was my only criterion. And so on the basis of that, I'm seeing this very dramatic change in behavior. Why are they operating these USOs predominantly at night? That is a good question. I don't know that I have the exact answer, but I've speculated. One reason might be our own means of detecting them improved dramatically during the 1950s and 60s. We started developing an underground sonar system, especially the United States Navy, that was able to detect them in the water. We were developing satellites above the ground, up in space, to detect these things, and all other kinds of instrumentation to see them in one way or another. And I wondered, I don't know if this is the reason or not, but for some reason, there was a massive global change in when they are appearing, and it's at night. So I wonder, were they trying to be a little bit more stealthy than before? Maybe. A couple of other things I noticed that the patterns within the data made me really stand up and pay attention. One was in what we can call electromagnetic interference cases. This is really strange. So I got my first electromagnetic interference case for the USOs was 1951. That was the first one where it's very obvious the witnesses are saying the electricity went out, the compasses went wild, this type of thing. So that was one factor that I looked for. Turns out from 1951 through the remainder, through 2024, 9.5% of all of the USO cases that I collected had some form of EM interference. It's almost 1 out of 10. It's quite a lot. But what makes it even more interesting is military cases had double that ratio. So 20% of military cases reported electromagnetic interference. And in the few instances where someone reported either missing time or sightings of some kind of beings connected with the ship or the craft, it was 4 times the amount. 4 times the amount. In other words, they were almost 40% of those cases reported electromagnetic interference. Now, this is not something that I was looking for in, collecting these cases. I don't think that that's a random result. I think that means something. And first of all, I think it speaks to probably the authenticity of these cases, that there is this type of consistency. But secondly, it speaks to behavioral aspects of the operators of these craft. So, for example, if someone has had missing time and there's electromagnetic interference that was reported, maybe something really happened there, and maybe the operators of those craft genuinely did take this person for a period of missing time, in the process screwing up some of their electronics. So there's things like this that I just found unexpected but compelling when I would study them. So I'm really glad that I was able to do the categories, and then furthermore take those categories and put them into a gargantuan, at least for me, spreadsheet that had all of this data fully available. And that spreadsheet, by the way, is a free download at my website. Anyone can get it. It's 37 pages. There's a lot there, but it's, if you're a real nerd for this type of thing, and if you've read the book, that spreadsheet could be quite interesting and helpful.
Yeah, there's plenty of nerds listening to this podcast. Many of them get in touch with me, so they will love that. You mentioned, obviously, as we go on through the decades, the equipment gets better, the sensors get better from a human perspective. We hear and have heard for many decades in ufology that radar can interfere with UFO systems, and perhaps this is a reason for many of these potential crashes, that it's our interference with their systems, or however those are working, that bring them down. Have you seen similar when it comes to sonar, for example, and potential interference with USOs?
I haven't seen any, I didn't collect any instances where sonar or our underwater technology resulted in the damage or incapacitation of a USO. It's possible that it happened. I didn't get any hint of that. However, there were instances in which it appeared, at least claims of things like USO retrieval attempts or operations. Yes. One case that I included in this book, I actually included it in an earlier book, UFOs for the 21st Century Mind, because this was a man that I personally spoke to. David Noble Whitehorse is his name. He's been publicly known. He was in the U.S. Navy in the early 1960s and told me, and has told many other people since, of when he was aboard a ship in the Pacific where there was an attempted retrieval of a object that came down from the sky, went into the ocean. It was a failed retrieval attempt. And I did include that in my book. That was from that went down from a series of nuclear test, a nuclear detonation, and that was what he stated. But in terms of other types of technology disabling these things, I did not see any indication of that like our sonar can inhibit them. I didn't see that.
Again, is that perhaps a nature of the environment of water and the medium of water, that you can see something fall out the sky and it lands in the desert, and you go and pick it up with a wench, and whatever, and retrieve the egg, as we've seen recently on video? Perhaps it's much more difficult if something does fall out the sky. Is it falling? Is it leaving and entering the water of its own accord? And then how do you even begin to find it once it's down there as well?
I had a pretty long discussion in one of my later entries of that first volume about this whole procedure of USO retrieval. Like, how practical is it or not? I had one individual who wrote to me personally about the claim that actually the first nuclear-powered submarine, which was the USS Nautilus, that was commissioned in 1954, had nuclear power. It was the first. That in the mid 60s, the claim was that it did go through an upgrade. So it was refurbished due to some damage that it originally took on during a military test, but it was refurbished. And according to the claim, was given a certain hatch by which it would be capable of bringing in ocean-based discs that were of a certain size or smaller, so that it was in other words commissioned for USO retrieval. So I try to explore this idea, and so what we could definitely say is that, first of all, the Nautilus was a somewhat small submarine by later standards. I don't know how useful it would have been for that. But even if it were used for that sort of thing, you're talking ocean shelf, not ocean floor. Because there's no way any of these subs are going to go down 15,000 feet to the bottom of the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. They could not withstand that pressure. They can withstand down to maybe some of them as much as 1,000 feet. So that would cover most of the ocean shelves of this planet. That's about 10% of the ocean right there. Because if you think about it, we've got shelves. In the case of North America, for example, we have a very large shelf extending, in some cases, a couple of 100 miles off the eastern United States coast. So you could engage in some type of operations that might involve a submarine. It's not impossible. We also have things like claws, big claws that can go down there, and they can actually go even deeper. They can go down to the ocean floor. So there are different ways of retrieving these things if it were desirable, and I'm sure it would be desirable.
When it comes to the water itself, something we've not mentioned yet, but is touched upon within the book and has been talked about in lore, is aliens coming here or NHI to use water as an energy source. How often did you see this crop up in your research, that they're not just using it as a medium to travel or hide themselves, but perhaps as a fuel?
Yeah, there's a number of instances that I did collect and did include in which these objects appear to be, for example, they'll be seen sucking up water.
Yeah.
So there's quite a few of those. In fact, I didn't even include all of those particular cases that I could have, but I did include a number of them. It was iffy to me, like, are they genuine USOs or not? If they're seen coming down and sucking up water, it's debatable. Maybe. I mean, I could have made the argument. I included some of those anyway because they are interesting, and I thought they needed some attention. So yeah, there are instances where these objects, they create this kind of pillar of water. They're clearly somehow interacting with the water to the extent that they want it. They're collecting some of this water. Is that for energy? Is that for some other purpose? This I don't know. But there's little question that at least in some of these cases, the occupants or intelligences that are operating these craft, they want that water.
There's a beautiful illustration from Alan in one of them with a disc-shaped object, and I'm colorblind, but I think it's kind of blue or metallic, is sucking up the water, and that was one I looked at and thought that would make a really nice print for like a wall or something. I'll need to try and remember exactly where it was, but it was a really nice picture.
Hey, cool. I just have to tell you, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go on.
Tracy, I got my first copy of the book from Amazon. I didn't have a full copy of it, so it just came in the mail. I have one hardcover and one paperback.
I had the book before Richard did, yeah, and many of you who got in touch as well. So nice to see it's finally arrived.
It looks good. The color illustrations are gorgeous. Here we go. There's one. That's Adak Island, 1945. That's actually the particular case that got me started on this whole thing. Some of these are full page. This is one of the Ghost rockets of 1946. I just love what Alan did here. That's just such a nice. What Alan did, I just have a moment to discuss his illustrations. What I love is that he brings the human beings into these events.
Yeah.
Most of these, you've got a human being accurately portrayed, like in he really took a lot of time to research the location, what that location looked like, what did people tend to wear, how did they, like, I think he did as careful a job as anyone could ask for in putting this together and putting the human being in these images, which I just loved.
Yeah,
that's exciting. I'm glad to get this.
He brings it to life beautifully, and on that as well. Like, I'll be honest. You mentioned it was Sunday. I received my copy. We're recording this on Wednesday. I've not had the chance to get through it. It's a gargantuan book, folks. A lot of work and effort has been put into this, and you can tell this is covering centuries alone just in this volume one. And it's very much it's worth the purchase. For you, I've not seen too many cases yet. Just in flicking through what I've gone through, how often do beings appear? Because when it comes to USOs, it seems, especially in the past, it's always about the object. But how often do we see physical beings involved in cases or events?
They're in there, but it's rare. So again, I did. If you were to go to the back, the second appendix of that book, which is 35 pages, that appendix is a data analysis of all of the categories and things. So I actually spent a lot of time analyzing that data. And one thing that I do discuss there are sightings of beings and cases of alleged, we'll say, missing time. So beings have been cited in, I think, about 3% total of all of these cases. So it's a small amount. Missing time is similar. So less than 5% for sure. But it does happen. There are some where there are beings, and where there's almost 700 cases, even that amounts to like 15 or so cases where there are beings cited throughout, and they're in there, but it's rare.
For you, Richard, what are some of your favorite cases from the book that maybe stand out, that they're a little bit different to the rest?
Oh man, I honestly, I love some of these cases. I love them just because they I would say just about every case in this book could practically be made into a 30-minute documentary. Some of them could be made into a movie. I think they're just that incredible. They're that cool. When you get into all of the factors that are involved, like what's going on in the witness's mind, what is going on in the mind of these occupants. Sometimes I wonder about this. What actually is going on? So there's a few cases that are just absolute favorites of mine. One, I have mentioned publicly once or twice before, but I just want to mention here because I love it. And in fact, Alan did an illustration of it. A married couple, an American couple in 1955. The family name was Bordus. We have their name. And they lived just north of New York City, about 30 miles north of New York City, which in 1955, there was a lot of beautiful nature that was there. And one thing they loved to do was night fishing. They love to do it. This is a fun little thing that they did. So they're out at a small reservoir, like a lake, maybe 2 miles in length, a half a mile in width. At midnight, they're alone, and they're night fishing in this ultra quiet place, surrounded by trees. It had to be very, very dark. And this is what they did. So they hear a splash, and they look, and they see this rose-colored, basketball-sized, glowing object rise from the water. So right away, that's interesting. There were two elongated tube-like lights that were bluish white, about 30 feet wide, each of them, along with this basketball light. And they were above the water. So they're on the shore looking at this, and the husband says to the wife, "I'm going to get into the rowboat and row out. I want to see this." The wife thought he was crazy. You could just see this scene happening, but he does row out there. As he's rowing out toward it, the object, or the lights, we could say, moved away from him at a speed faster than he was able to row. And by the way, on this lake or reservoir, no boats other than rowboats were allowed on this body of water. So no motorboats were allowed. But whatever this was moving farther away from him. So he decided, well, I'll just row back to my wife. So he gets back to shore, but then they decide to go home, but they parked 1 full mile from where they were. They had to get into their boat and row a mile to their parking lot. And while they're doing this, the lights are following them at times illuminating their boat and illuminating them the whole way. I would love to have seen the entire mile-long row that they went through during this whole thing while they got back to their car. Even in the parking lot, they were able to see this. That couple was interviewed very shortly after this by an active investigative group at the time known as Civilian Saucer Investigation, CSI. They were, for a little while in the 50s, they were quite active and very good. They wrote an extended report analysis of this, interviewed these witnesses at great length, found them very credible. It's a pretty well-researched and well-regarded case that unfortunately was just completely forgotten after it happened. Another one that I love from this volume, I mentioned the Adak Island case. It's off the Aleutian Islands from 1945. It was the case that started me on this whole journey, and I do think it's an incredible case. At the end of World War II, or in the summer of 1945, Japan is still fighting. Germany is not. An American transport vessel returning from Japan to Seattle. It's traversing the northern Pacific there by the Aleutian Islands. One of those islands is known as Adak Island, A-D-A-K. And the members of this ship saw, apparently, a disc-shaped saucer emerge from the ocean, circle around their ship a couple of times, and then zip off, leaving some bright lights in its wake. One of the members of that ship, some years later, maybe 15 years later, 20 years later, spoke to a number of UFO researchers about this, including atmospheric physicist Dr. James McDonald, who was a very well-known researcher at that time, and brilliant man. It seems like a very good case. And 1945, an object coming out of the water. There are just so many of these that I find utterly fascinating. I don't know if I could even describe all. One other I'll mention concerning a U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was a very, very important aircraft carrier back in the 1950s and 60s, and was decommissioned in the 70s. So the FDR had, in its career, had many UFO encounters, actually, and many USO encounters. One that came to us through one of the officers of the ship from 1954. He wrote anonymously, but in great detail, to the online magazine, you could say, of Filer's Files, run by U.S. Air Force Major George Filer, who's still with us, still around. And he's collected these for years and years. So this came to Filer's Files. The guy wrote a very detailed description of what happened in 1954. He didn't give the location. He didn't give his name. He left a number of details out, but he was very explicit about how the FDR was in a cigar-shaped object, descended, a very large one, disabled all of their electronics and communications and weapons systems. They were not able to launch any fighter aircraft, apparently, and they tried to. Two disc-shaped objects came out of the water and eventually merged with the cigar-shaped object, which at the end of the encounter descended into the water, according to this man. He gave a minute-by-minute account, literally a minute-by-minute account. Very meticulous. He actually stated he was one of the officers of the ship. He wasn't just an enlisted guy. He was an officer. I think that's an incredible account. I did a lot of research into the FDR, and I couldn't figure out what body of water it was in. But what I learned is that in 1954, the FDR, which was frequently stationed in the Mediterranean Sea, was traveling to Seattle, Washington, for what would be a 2-year overhaul. And I learned it was too big to fit through the Panama Canal. So the FDR had to go out the Mediterranean, down the Atlantic Ocean, around the tip of South America, up the other side, the Pacific side, to Seattle. It had a very, very long route. And it was somewhere along that transport that it engaged this USO, or these UFOs. Amazing, amazing stuff.
Do you think, as a species, given you've spent 3 years plus on this book now and done so much research, should we focus more on exploring our own oceans than we should looking off into space and the stars?
In looking for UFOs or UAP, you mean?
Just in general, as a species,
Oh,
we seem to be trying to go off. Let's go back to the moon. Let's
oh,
try
I
and get
see.
here. We seem to explore so much less the oceans. Yet here is a full book, which is just a part of the evidence you've managed to look through and present, and all this data to say there's all these incredible things under the water. Why aren't we going down there to explore?
Well, it's very difficult. The pressures are very, very difficult for us to navigate and manage. When you get down to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, this is not easy to do. Our submarines cannot go down that far. Certainly, no human divers can go down that far. It's just not possible. The pressures are too great. Human divers are able to go down maybe, I mean, if you're a real pro, maybe 300 feet. And even that's a stretch, usually 200 feet. So we're not even going down a fraction of a mile as divers. Now, when you go down in certain submersibles, you can, but it's not easy. So that's one thing. In my view, the only real way that we would be able to have a kind of ability to stay down there in an extended way would be if we were to create a kind of you have to create a very stable undersea environment, either literally under the ocean floor or inside like an ocean mountain, for example. That could happen. That I could imagine we would have the ability to do. And then you'd have a secure base of operations in there. Oxygen conceivably might not be a problem if you're able to do electrolysis from the water. This is what submarines do, nuclear subs, which stay under the water for many, many months at a time. They're not carrying around a bunch of oxygen tanks. They're extracting oxygen from the water. So we know how to do that. And we probably can do a lot of other things. If you find like a nice geothermal source, that could be an energy source. Or you could bring a local portable nuclear device down there for your energy, conceivably. Like there are ways of doing it. So I don't think that's impossible. And I could imagine that there would be some motivation, at least from a military perspective. You could see militaries wanting to do this. And it's possible. I wouldn't even say it's impossible that some of the militaries of this world, US, may be doing this without anyone knowing. I would never rule that out. Is it easier or harder than going out into space? That's a good question. I don't know. I think they're both very difficult. They're both very tough. And, there used to be a lot of futuristic accounts from a century or more ago, early 20th century, late 19th century, where I read some of these. I looked at some really cool, crazy pictures where, these futurists back then thought, oh, yeah, we'll be able to live down in the ocean,
Yeah.
just like above the surface. And it's kind of funny to see just how naive some of these thoughts really were. It's a lot more difficult. But to your question, like, I don't think that it's impossible. Is it more advantageous or not than to go off world is a question that I don't know if I have the answer to that one. That's a good question. It's worth thinking about.
What I'd like to do before we get to listener questions, which cover the USO topic, I want to sidebar quickly and get your thoughts on some modern, current, up to date, state of play UFO questions, and then we'll get back to the USO topic and finish off there. A whole lot has happened in the last few months, Richard, that I'd love to get your take on. First off, the task force that has just been set up by Congress, looking into a number of what, let's be fair, the general public will call conspiracy theories.
Yes.
So UFOs, 9/11, COVID, the Bin Laden death, JFK, Martin Luther King, the Epstein list, as a task force with a 6-month window to uncover the greatest secrets in modern history being set up to fail.
They can't do this all in 6 months. It's just not going to be possible. However, I'm not willing to just speculate in saying that they're intentionally setting themselves up to fail. Although it's impossible for me to see how they can succeed in all of these areas. I personally am glad that this is happening. I mean, let's get real. A genuine 9/11 investigative body, we haven't had anything like that even remotely. So I'm glad to see that. COVID origins, I'm glad to see that. We did have, 50 years ago, a JFK investigation by Congress back in 1975. They did a pretty good job, by the way, at that time. They did conclude that there were multiple shooters. This was a congressional investigation led by Frank Church of Idaho, and that was their conclusion. So I'm hoping that Anna Paulina Luna, who's running this task force, that they will at least be able to refer to some of the findings from then. But they're doing a lot of things here, and I think it's good that we're questioning it. My hope is that they at least get some success, some breakthroughs, so that we want to continue and follow up with more. And that's going to be the real question. Will they do that? In the case of the Church Committee of 1975, they found their conclusions, shut up shop, and then just headed for the hills, and we never heard from them again.
Yeah.
So I hope that that's not the case here.
So if you're the secret keepers, the gatekeepers, the shadowy cabal, let's stick with UFOs then for now, that have been in charge of this secret for decades, how would you be viewing this task force and what this administration now, going into the Trump administration, of course, could potentially do? Are you worried or panicking, or is this something you've seen many times before and you're just going to bat another ball away?
Yeah, well, the Trump, this particular Trump administration, as opposed to the first one, is very interesting for many reasons. I mean, we can see, unlike the first time around, things are really being shaken up internationally as well as domestically. It's really quite extraordinary, and there are people who, Trump's very polarizing. People who love him, people who hate him. But I think even those who hate him, I think it would be a mistake to overlook what is definitely, I'll say, in my opinion, a war that is going on with certain established interests within the United States government and the international, let's say, Team Global. He's really at odds with it. He's at war with it. How far that will go? Well, we can see that when it comes to UFOs or UAP, there may be not much difference. Take, for example, the explanation that the Trump White House gave on the drones.
Yeah.
They had the press conference there, and that could have been word for word right out of the Biden White House, what they said there. So for all of the other types of change that they may want to do, it could very well be that when it comes to UFOs or UAP, it's not clear to me that there is going to be any difference. But I don't want to be guided by that first press conference. I'm not willing to say that they're not going to move on this. It's hard to know. There are a number of members of Congress, mostly Republicans, some Democrats, who are really interested in moving this UFO topic forward. And that is one of the mandates of Anna Paulina Luna's group. They're UFOs and USOs, by the way. They mentioned that. So that's interesting to me. And we're at a point now where, so if I were on this team of secrecy, how would I be reacting to this? One thing that I have to assume that they're doing is they're looking at all kinds of spin and narrative control to come out of this, which is something they're very good at, and they've been able to do all along. I mean, think about all of the revelations that have come out in the last decade. Quite a lot, from 2017 onward. We know that the Pentagon has had several UFO-related organizations, ATIP, OSAP. There was the failed Kona Blue. There's all of these things. We didn't know about them at the time. We know that the Navy and other branches are encountering these objects, and with some pretty extraordinary encounters indeed. We learned about the Nimitz Tic Tac encounter. We learned about many, many things, protocols that are in place and so forth. These are extraordinary developments that, if all of them were to have come out more than 10 years ago, I would have thought, oh, well, disclosure is going to happen. They can't let this much information out and not admit it. But guess what? All of this and more have come out, and we are still at this kindergarten level here. We're still debating, are these real? Are these extraterrestrial? Are these anomalous? That to me is an amazing win by them. That's an incredible bit of narrative control that they've done. So I would never underestimate the deep state or the national security state's ability to continue to maintain narrative control over this. They still, the legacy media, increasingly people don't really listen to or care for it anymore. So that weapon is becoming weaker, but they still have it. They still have remarkable control over public narrative. I mean, think about something like the John F. Kennedy assassination, since this is, again, being researched by the Congress. We're at a point now, it's 62 years later, or 61 years later, and pretty much everyone in the world knows there was some kind of conspiracy going on there. Who really honestly believes that Lee Harvey Oswald did that all by himself and that there were no shenanigans involved in his assassination? The killing of Oswald, to say nothing of the killing of so many people connected to JFK and Oswald in the aftermath of that assassination, which is itself an incredible series of murders. We know all of this, and still, 2025, the official word is that there was a lone gunman at Dealey Plaza that day, even though no one really believes it. The point is, the official word is that it was Oswald by himself, and that therefore there's no justice, no public policy to rectify this essentially coup d'etat of the American government in 1963. So if we're not there with JFK, with all of the knowledge that we have, what are we going to be doing with UFOs? Or UAP? All of this information comes out, but you can imagine the government, the secret keepers that are behind the government, the nexus of private-public power that, in my view, certainly has dominant control over this. They are not going to just walk away from the table here. And they will do everything they can, I guarantee this, to fight any new narratives that are coming along. And they will just play as much defense on this as they can. So it's going to be very difficult. If there is a breakthrough, it will be something that is beyond their control, something that just spills out, that somehow can hit the sweet spot, as it were, and cause an avalanche of truth. Maybe that can happen. But the game plan, I think we can see, it will be what has been the game plan for this past decade. It is to control the public narrative and spin as much as possible.
Yeah, I think the argument online for many was, they can't put the toothpaste back in the tube this time. They can certainly hide the tube from us, and there's plenty of toothpaste left in it, and they can certainly replace the toothpaste tube as well. So I'm in agreement with you there that it's not an easy road by any means. Something that kind of has happened and has been a bit of a waterfall with is the whistleblowers coming forward over the last couple of months, particularly Jake Barber coming forward in a pretty explosive way, mentioning his Skywatcher organization, which allegedly now in the next couple of days or a week or so is going to release data. And I think they're being quite bullish about the quality of data they're going to release, which appears to be a good thing. What are your thoughts on this kind of new age of the whistleblower we appear to be in? I'm coining that phrase. Sorry, folks, you've heard me say it a few times. And some of the allegations around psionics and summoning craft.
I'm absolutely fascinated by this. I was riveted by the Jake Barber interview that Ross Coulthart did. I was absolutely fascinated. I know there's some haters out there really criticizing it, saying there was nothing new, nothing provable. News Nation overly hyped it. To the last of which, yes, News Nation did hype that very much in advance, making it seem like this would be an irrevocable disclosure, and it wasn't. The thing about the Jake Barber revelations, as good as they were, and they are good, they're not at the level where they're going to convince a hardened skeptic. They're just not. Barber didn't really give unequivocal proof that he transported a UFO. We saw the video of an egg-shaped object, which turns out wasn't apparently from his retrieval. It was some other retrieval. Okay, fine. Barber gave his strong opinion that what he was transporting and encountering was of non-human origin, but couldn't really prove it. That aside, I think his testimony is absolutely welcome. I'm very glad that we know who he is now. It's hard to impugn his integrity, in my opinion, from everything we've learned about him. And this whole concept of psionics, this is quite interesting. So we're talking about essentially people with psychic capabilities being utilized to communicate with the operators of these craft. And in ways, by the way, that many people could argue are not very ethical. I mean, let's just get real. You're using your telepathic capabilities to vector in these craft very much in a CE5 type of system that we've heard from Dr. Stephen Greer for years. Seems to be very much the same type of thing. So to use that to vector them in and then, I guess what, to disable them and capture them? Is that what's happening? The impression that I get at times is that is what they're trying to do. You could really debate the ethics of that. I would like to hear Jake Barber talk a little bit more about this. But the point is, are psionics being used? And I have no reason to doubt this whatsoever. I think that, I mean, I'm married to a remote viewer, and I have studied as a layperson remote viewing for 20 plus years. I'm fascinated by it. I'm friends with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, the creators of the remote viewing program. I know them both quite well. I've talked with many remote viewers. I need no persuasion that that is a real thing, that there is this capability, that we innately have psychic type abilities, and some are very good at it. So why wouldn't you want to use certain individuals for purposes having to do with these extraterrestrials, particularly when you go through the lore, you go through the reports and the testimony, frequently, typically, they will communicate telepathically, so it seems. And so that would be of great use. So I think that's really interesting that he did that. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of what he has to say about this and, whatever results of his organization happen to be.
Yeah, I mentioned when I was speaking to Danny Sheehan that I was on a podcast with some friends of mine. It's completely unrelated to UFOs, very much general pop culture conversation. They wanted to chat UFOs. I sent them the link to the Jake Barber interview. They watched clips of it, and their opinion was they found the notion of the crash retrieval aspect of this interesting. As soon as psionics were mentioned, as soon as his experience were mentioned, they said it was all nonsense and BS. And I think a lot of the public, not all, but would see it the same.
Yeah.
I don't think that because of, the nature of what we do, and I can believe these things, but I think a lot of the public still struggle with that. So if you've still got that public perception, and we've got this political progress potentially with these task forces and whatnot, and more whistleblowers coming forward, how do you see 2025 playing out?
Yeah, the problem with this whole phenomenon is that it doesn't behave the way we would like it to behave. We want, and I include myself here. For years, I wanted all my aliens to look like gray aliens with big black eyes. I wanted them all to look the same. I wanted all the craft to be kind of similar. I wanted their behaviors to be similar. Well, it's just not, that's not the case. And then, of course, all the, what we have come to call high strangeness in connection with this. Implicitly, we don't want that because we want to be able to understand this. We want it to be comprehensible to us. But the reality seems to be that, do we human beings actually think that we have figured out the full nature of the fabric of reality? Honestly, do we really think that? Einstein was only a little over a century ago where he comes up with this various theories of relativity. It's not that long. It's not that long that we understand that space and time are a kind of fabric. Goes against all common sense. As far as with psychic types of capabilities, look, I think skeptics really need to get over this. The evidence for some kind of genuine psychic capability is very overwhelming, in my view. I think it's very strong. I realize that hardened skeptics won't agree, but there's too much that's there, in my opinion, to dismiss. So that leads to your question, which actually I think I can't remember all of it. I think you asked something like, what would it take? Could you rephrase that? I apologize.
Just how do you see 2025 playing out when you've got a public perception which is still quite stigmatized, but we're seeing potential progress politically, and that feeds into the mainstream?
Yeah.
Where does that lead? And I agree, things are very fragmented at the minute and a bit split up.
Well, we're living in an era right now of upheaval geopolitically. You have the Americans and Russians talking as you and I are talking right now in Saudi Arabia. This is a political earthquake. The European leadership is not happy about this, by the way, but it's portending major changes for sure. So there's a lot that is going to suck the oxygen out of the room. It's not just all going to be about UAP or UFOs. To the extent that the public's even going to be paying attention to this is something that I would not take for granted. I would not assume that this is going to be some news headline dominating thing. We did have UAP take the news a bit in 2024. I imagine that will continue, but I don't know that we're going to be seeing disclosure headlines this year. I would be surprised, frankly, if we did. I don't expect that. I do expect some fits and spurts of moments where it becomes a big thing and then probably will recede. There'll probably be some important testimony that comes out. I expect that we will see more whistleblowers, the new generation, as you call them. I think it's probably appropriate. But I don't know. I don't know that it's going to be any game changer at this time. On the other hand, look, at some point there will be a game changer. And then all of my previous predictions of, well, we're not going to see a breakthrough will be wrong. And at some point, I do think that all of the machinations, all of the secrecy that's going on to keep this covered, at some point it'll all have failed. I don't think that this is it's possible to keep this subject under wraps the way it has been for the last 80 plus years, forever. I just don't see that. At some point, it's going to break out. The real question is when and to what extent. We were talking about psionics, and you were pointing out that people are very skeptical of this type of thing. And it's worth it to mention at this point here that when we talk about something like disclosure, we really need to ask, what is going to be disclosed? How much is going to be disclosed? How radical is this hidden world really? Are we okay? So would disclosure mean we're going to acknowledge that there are genuine UFOs that seem to be non-human, or will it involve there are genuine UFOs that seem to be non-human, and we've been encountering them for the militaries for years, and we have some of their stuff and their technology and some bodies? Or will it include some of them are alive and we've been communicating with them? Now it's getting a little crazier. Will it include some of them have permanent bases here on Earth and one of them is 2 miles from your house? Is that going to be included? Or will it be included that some of them do abductions? Will it be included that some of them are totally telepathic and can do mind control over you when they want? Because that's been claimed. Will it be included that some of them look like human beings and they're walking among us, which has been a claim? Is that going to be included? This gets crazier and crazier. Will it be that we'll say, and actually we have our own little breakaway group that has a base on the moon or on the Mars? Like, I don't know if we do, but is it possible? I would say, yes, it's possible. So what we don't really know is how far a genuine disclosure will go or is capable of going. We don't know these things. So as truth comes out in the course of 2025 and 2026, we need to be asking ourselves, like, how far can this go? And how much can the public actually take? You think of the general public back in the 1950s. how much could they have taken compared to now? So this is a long path. And I think that we're able to handle more than our grandparents did. But is the full effect of this maybe the fact that they can manipulate space-time in ways that we don't quite understand? Would we really be able to handle this? Would we be able to handle the fact that they have like 3 or 4 times our intellect and they have a hive mind, and there's no way in hell that we can compete with them intellectually or ever can? Even if they want to bring us into their galactic federation, will we ever really be at their level? Like, there's a lot of questions going on here that I don't think that, honestly, anyone in the disclosure community is really asking, to be perfectly candid about it. And I'm friends with everyone there, and I respect them, but I just don't think we've been asking many of these questions.
How long have you got, Richard, left to get into some listener questions?
I'm all yours, man.
Awesome. That's what I like to hear. Well, let's dive into the murky waters then of listener questions. And I got so many through. So thank you to everyone who sent them over. Richard's a popular guest. I'll get to the ones I can. Some of you asked questions that were repeating, or others, they were in the body of the interview already. So Algo asks, which cases did Richard not include in the books because they would be too controversial or too weird?
Well, I don't know that I excluded any case because it was too controversial. There are cases that I included that I discussed without considering them active cases. So I mentioned earlier the Christopher Columbus sighting, which is one such case. I actually did a treatment of it. I talked about it, and but it's in another part of the book, not with the cases. But there's some more contemporary ones that I kept apart. So, for example, the Baltic Sea anomaly, which we discovered a little over a decade ago. So that's very interesting, the so-called Millennial Falcon. And I do have a write-up of it. I can't remember. I think I have that write-up in the introduction of this first volume. I could now check. But my conclusion is that it's probably not a USO, even though it's interesting. Another one is the Malibu Formation off the coast of California, where we heard people. Jimmy Church brought this out many years ago, and other people followed up. If you look on Google Earth, there is what does look like under the water, like a flattened surface with these pillars. Looks kind of like a base, potentially, and it is interesting. That one deserves more research, and we really need to get a proper remotely operated vehicle down there and give us some up-close video. But to me, my conclusion, at least provisionally, is that it's probably a natural geological formation. This is what the geologists seem to be saying, and I'm not inclined to argue with them. So I have a discussion of that, but I don't include it as a genuine USO. My attitude about these is, if there's something that's well known, but even if I think it's not a genuine USO, I want to have it in there just for discussion, because it's part of our broader discussion on the subject. So I've tried not to eliminate something for that reason. Now, there are cases that I eliminated, many cases, because I just thought they were too threadbare. They very possibly could have been true. But, a lot of the cases that I would find are just, they're so bare bones. There's not much that I can do with them. And I just thought, if I have, if I have too little to work with, I'm just not going to include it, even though it could be the germ of something that was true. So if there was not enough content to work with, I probably left it out, generally speaking. Mostly my criteria was I would include a case if, after reviewing it and reading it, I found myself nodding my head thinking, I like this case. Purely subjective, but I like to think that my judgment on this is is good enough. I mean, I've been looking at UFO cases for more than 30 years. So if there was a USO case that I thought this smells right, I would include it. It was that simple. Very subjective ultimately when you get right down to it. It's like, can I do something with this? Can I describe this in an appropriate way? And does it feel, and does it have enough that I would say, yes, this is credible, decent source, or a good testimony that's got detail, that type of thing.
You touch on underwater bases potentially. Kevin asks, how does Richard assess the likelihood of underwater bases, and where would the best candidates be?
Oh, yeah, that's a really hard one. I tried this. I tried to look for any really genuine research or investigation of any sort into undersea bases. What I found was there were a number of researchers over many years who strongly believed in the location of alien bases in a number of places. And I took that all seriously. So there are a few places where I personally think there are underwater bases. I firmly believe this. And I'll give a few candidates. One, I would say in or near the Puerto Rico Trench, north of Puerto Rico. There are just an overwhelming number of USO and UFO cases around the island of Puerto Rico. It's ridiculous. I think of Puerto Rico as like the USO capital of the world. It's remarkable. And there's a massive trench north of the island that is incredibly deep, very, very deep. And there have been a number of cases seen at that trench. And I strongly suspect there's something there. It'd be a great place. It would be a great place to have an undersea base. Also, in the U.S., many people talk about Catalina Island. This is off the coast of Los Angeles, a part of what are called the Channel Islands. And indeed, there are many USO cases there. Many really good ones. I would not be shocked at all if there's a USO base there. But there's a few other locations. One off the coast of South America in the Atlantic, not far from Buenos Aires. I would say that's quite possible. There are a number of researchers who believe that there are bases down. There is a base at least down there. I would never argue against that. Possibly also on the other side of South America, off the coast of Chile, quite possibly. In East Asia, most definitely. I would be surprised if there wasn't a base somewhere in or near the South China Sea. There's quite a bit of activity in that portion of the world in terms of USOs. And but honestly, here's the thing. I could imagine an undersea base almost anywhere. Almost anywhere. There are a couple of crazy encounters that I found up near the Aleutian Island change. I mentioned the Adak Island case from 1945, but there are quite a few from that region. That's a very inhospitable part of the world, and yet we have reports of these objects entering and emerging from the water there. Now, I mean, why wouldn't they have a base there? It's very cold, but potentially you could do it. Also, that region of the ocean is actually very shallow water. We may remember when the ocean levels were just a little bit lower, that region was connected between Asia and North America. It was bearing landmass and it was quite wide. So a lot of that water is only a few hundred feet deep. And conceivably, you could have a base under the ocean floor there. You wouldn't have to go 15,000 feet down. So I think there's a number of places where it's quite feasible that you could have an undersea base. And one other region. Now, I mean, these cases are very heavily centered on U.S. American reporting. There's a decent number of European reporting, particularly from Italy. I can mention them. But the U.S. has always been very active with reporting this. So it's very likely U.S. biased. So keeping that in mind. but I would still be shocked if there wasn't a USO base somewhere off the northeastern coast of the United States. There are we're talking the New York, Massachusetts, down maybe even to Virginia area, off that whole ocean shelf could very easily have an undersea base. I could easily imagine that. There's so many cases there.
I had a few folks reach out to ask if you had seen the 4chan post about the whistleblower claims of the giant underwater UFO mothership. There was rumors there was a ship that it was mobile, and if it was approached, it would move and disappear for days at a time and then go back. Is that something you'd seen online or knew anything about?
I need to research that because that's quite fascinating, and I want to know it. So that I don't know if that's quite recent or not, but I've not heard this. Yeah. So in the last 3-4 months, I have not done as much active research because I've been trying to put the books together, and that one got past me. But I can tell you this: when the 3rd volume comes out later this year, I do plan to do a last scouring sweep of 2024 and even 2025 cases. And I will include them, even though they won't be part of my statistical breakdown. I still will want to include them. So I'm sure I will look into that. And I'll be interested in what that's all about.
Yeah. Melanie says, and I'm going to hopefully pronounce this correctly, can you ask Richard why he didn't include the Utsuro Bune case from 1803? It's called a myth, but has pretty good documentation considering what else was available from Japan.
Yeah, maybe I should have included that in the introduction or in the first chapter where I discuss these ancient USOs or claims of. For those people who are not familiar with this, it's based on it. We have this very interesting illustration from that period, from the early 19th century of Japan. The idea is it is a myth. A beautiful princess was found in this kind of egg-shaped craft that came in from the ocean and was somehow opened up, and she appeared. And as I recall, I don't think she was known to say anything about where she was from or what she was. I could be wrong there. It is. I do consider it a myth. I don't consider it a genuine USO event, but I probably should have discussed it at greater length. One reason is that the Japanese and the Chinese both have some pretty good ancient potential USO and definite UFO accounts from their ancient history. Both of those nations have a long history of literacy, so they were able to write their cases down just like the Europeans did back in the times of the Middle Ages. So there are some actual very interesting potential Japanese and Chinese cases. And I do discuss some of those early ones, but I just I didn't. I think she's right in questioning that, and I probably should have at least had a mention of it. But the reality is I don't consider that a likely USO candidate, so I did not include it.
Fair enough, and thank you, Melanie. Purple Burglar, who again I'll always say I hate the name because I can't say it with a Scottish accent. Based on your decades of research into UFOs, government secrecy, and the breakaway civilization hypothesis, what do you believe is the single most compelling piece of evidence that humanity is not in control of its own destiny?
Oh, wow. That would take us all afternoon to discuss, because I don't know if I could say there's a single piece of evidence. There's a cumulative argument to say that what we call UAP are real and are physical and are technological. And I, again and again and again, refer people to a very substantial amount of declassified documentation, primarily from the United States military, that attests to this, that describes objects that are not supposed to exist, that are described as disc-shaped, where you have attempted jet interceptions and fighter jets intercepting these and failing to, and with a remarkable amount of description of these types of observations and trackings, electronic observations, and so forth. So that's, I think, a very powerful argument to say there is someone else here, and there is secrecy about that. I've been arguing this for 30 years, just about. Now, the fact that we're not in control of our own destiny, This is a very profound question to ask. And I'm going to, I mean, I love this question. And I don't know if I want to or am able to answer it fully at this time. I think it's a profound question. The question is, are we in control of our destiny? I mean, we're getting into a philosophical issue here, independent of aliens. Do we really, as a species, have an ability to control anything? We talk about artificial intelligence today. There have been people who for 30 years have said we need to stop the development of this because we're going to lose control of it. 30 years, more. And people back then would laugh and say, are you on drugs for thinking this? How can that possibly happen? We have no ability to stop this train. It's a runaway train, and we are all on it. We have no ability to control this. You have these people saying, well, we should regulate this and control that. And I just laugh. I think we have such a pretense of thinking that we are actually managing ourselves with any real foresight. I think we're not at all. Then throw in the factor of an advanced intelligence that's here, doing what it wants to do, essentially with impunity. We have no ability to deal with these beings, or limited. So I like this question a lot. And I'll probably want to treat it in one of the introductions or conclusions of volumes 2 and or 3. So that's about all I can say about it for now.
That's a good compliment for the question. It's a big question, but yeah, you've answered it well as well. Skeptical Believer says, does the fact there are so many USOs and UAP impact your thoughts on what the probable non-human intelligence is or where they're from?
Yeah. I think about this all the time, and I'm constantly trying to refine what I think. This is what I think currently. There are so many of these craft above and below water, around everywhere. So I ask myself frequently, what is their own infrastructure? Like, how many of them are there? How many craft do they have operating here? How many of them physically, what's their population here? I mean, these are hard questions for me to answer, but no one asks them at all. So I'm just, left to my own devices to try to think this through. So my provisional answer is there's enough of them here that it's a substantial infrastructure. So then I have to ask, is that infrastructure here on Earth? Are they building ships here? If so, where? Or do they have an infrastructure far away in some way or another, and they're just they figured out a way to get here in large numbers? And I think currently that it's the latter of those. So I tend to think, I don't think they're building their craft here. They could be. It's possible. But I think it strikes me as more likely that they have figured out a way to manipulate space-time sufficiently that these immense distances between the stars are not so immense to them. And that they may have a substantial portion of their societies that are tasked with investigating Earth. It may be that. I mean, think about where we are at in our development. We've gone, I say this a lot, but it's worth repeating. In just 2 centuries, we've gone from, 2 centuries is what, 8, 9 generations. It's not, think about, mice in a laboratory. 8 generations is not long. So 8 human generations, we go from these wooden ships out at sea with sails to everything that we have now on the cusp of AI. We've gone to the moon. We've gone out in space. We've studied the subatomic world. I mean, good Lord, we've done a lot in 200 years. That's not much time at all. So I have to think any species that has the ability to monitor us, it's got to be looking at us very carefully right now with a lot of interest. So I think I can envision an ET society or group of them that says, all right, we're going to send this committee or this group and we're going to give some of you permission to visit Earth.
Yep.
Back and forth. Like there could be a lot of them that are tasked with coming here and going back and forth. If it's easier for them to manipulate space-time, to create the space-time bubble, variations of Alcubierre's equations or whatever, then the distance argument really isn't such a big deal. And you could have a fairly substantial amount of their society able to go back and forth. And I sometimes wonder, maybe that's what we're dealing with. There's a lot of them. And their attitude could be a lot of different attitudes. They could be supportive of us. They could be skeptical of us. They could think, these humans, they are clever, but they're also at a very violent place. Do we want... I mean, maybe some of these other aliens are violent. Maybe some of these other aliens are every bit as materialistic and grasping and greedy as we are. It's not impossible. And whether they are or aren't, they might be looking at us thinking, well, these humans could be a real pain in the ass in the near future. They get strong AI, they get quantum computing. Who knows what we'll be able to do in another century? We might be enough that we'll be an annoyance that they have to eventually take notice of. So there could be a lot of things going on where they are trying to engage with us, but they might realize it would be very destabilizing to our world if they were to be out in the open with it, which it would be destabilizing. And we don't know what those ramifications would be. Even now, with genuine disclosure, we don't really know. And so they might be thinking, we're not going to be the ones to do it. We'll let them figure this out. So let's not step on the flowers. Let's not cause too much disruption. It's easy for us to go back in time 1,000 years and see why aliens would not announce themselves then. It would be absolutely overwhelming to human societies of any earlier period, that it would probably, honestly, would probably just destroy them psychologically. I could imagine it would be a really difficult thing for them to wrap their brains around. So you wouldn't do that. I would hope that it would be, if there's any interstellar law that I hope exists, it's that one, some kind of prime directive, where you would not interfere with the development of an intelligent species that is able, that's developing. But so if our ancestors were fragile, what makes us think that we're any less fragile? Maybe a little less, but I could see hyper intelligent aliens thinking, yeah, you think you're advanced, but maybe not so much, guys. So you figure this out. When you figure this out, we'll make our next decision then.
I could spend all day in those sorts of questions, and if people want an insight into what I think about randomly during the day, things like, and I asked a guest this recently, it might have been Danny Sheehan, I can't remember, around what if there's only about 4 craft, triangles, for example. What if there was 4 on this entire planet at any one time, and people just see them because of the speed they can travel, how they maneuver, they can manipulate space-time. What if the saucers, there was only ever 2 that crashed on this planet? Everything else has been something else, and those saucers were from a different location. You mentioned that manufacturing idea, the whole thing of, okay, so do they build these things in a factory? Are they grown? Are they kind of thought into existence? Are they just there, that they aren't even
Right.
developed? All those kind of weird things that and people sometimes ask, if you got disclosure, would that be the podcast finished because you would know? And I'm like, no, for the love of God, that would be the start of the questions, because there would be so much I would want to know. And I always love to think of, if we got the boring White House lawn disclosure, where it would now be Trump, could you imagine? And Musk, no doubt, beside him with his kid,
Sure.
saying, yeah, here's the aliens in the saucer, we're bringing them out for you. And we say, anyway, guys, the Tic Tacs you've got, and they go, oh, we don't know what those are. Yeah, but we've got these Tic Tac things. No, those aren't us. We don't know what those are. We assume that these things would come down and give us all these answers, but perhaps there are many things they don't know.
Indeed. Yeah, I agree with everything you've said there.
Yeah.
We don't know how much the deep state knows about this. We don't know what their knowledge of this is. I'm going to assume, though, that they have more than we plebes here have, but they don't have everything that they want. I'm sure that there are questions that they do not have answered. So that'll be a very interesting little dance that happens if it ever does.
Yep. So Ricky says, you might have mentioned this in your book, but is there a body of water that most wouldn't expect to have USO activity, but it does?
There were a few that, first of all, these occurred in almost every body of water. Where I didn't get a lot of cases was in most areas of the South Pacific Ocean. But of course, very few people live in the South Pacific Ocean, which I think is probably the biggest reason why. The Indian Ocean, the mass of the Indian Ocean, similar, did not have many, except for the Arabian Sea, which was closer to the shore there, where we do have a few cases. One area that I don't know that I had any predisposition one way or the other, but that had quite a few, was the Strait of Malacca. So the Strait of Malacca, for those that don't know, it's a very narrow, critically important sea lane that's right out by Singapore. And one of the Indonesian islands goes alongside it, and you've got this long, narrow strip of water that these days all Chinese shipping has to go through. If you want to ship to and from China from many parts of the world, you have to go through the Strait of Malacca, and it's not very wide. I have 4 really interesting cases of bizarre underwater luminous activity that were recorded there, and I don't know what this is. But as far as other bodies of water that I would not have expected, there's one in Asia as well called the Sea of Okhotsk, which is off of eastern Siberia. God almighty, like, it's one of these places that's one of the most inhospitable seas in the world. It's like covered in fog 6 months out of the year. The water is bitter cold in the winter. The seas are rough there. And yet we have quite a few Soviet Navy cases of USOs coming into and out of the Sea of Okhotsk or operating underneath there. I don't know. I think even in the Arctic Ocean, we have a couple of pretty interesting cases that are way, way up, like north of Iceland, north of the North Sea. I haven't really found an area where they just haven't been seen. Even not far from the Antarctic coast, there are some cases down by like South Georgia Island, which is getting close to Antarctica. So I don't know. I think they're kind of everywhere.
I'm going
A couple
to
of good cases by you're in Britain. And I just want to point out there's one of the earliest cases is out of a little river in Scotland from 1767, which I think is an interesting case. Kind of bizarre, but it's interesting. And there's a few others that are from the North Sea, from the English Channel, off the coast of the Bay of Biscay, near off the coast of France there. They're pretty much everywhere.
So these next 2 questions, I'm going to read you together, and you'll see why. So Steve asks, what are the possibilities for citizens or scientists to study USOs? Something like a Galileo project for the seas, or will the knowledge be limited to military encounters? And I'll add into that, because I think it bleeds in. Teresa asks, I'm curious, what does Richard think is the best way to investigate USOs, research vessels, mapping, with the waters being so vast?
Yeah, 2 great questions. They do go together. Well, we're developing better and better types of ROVs, remotely operated vehicles that operate within the water. The capabilities are vastly better than what we had a few generations ago. The best capabilities are certainly with the United States Navy here. But so in terms of what like the U.S. Navy has, you can have autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, I think they're called, that no longer have to be tethered to a ship to be able to operate, so they can have a greater range. And I see that with civilian applications happening more and more. I mean, we're now seeing civilian applications in terms of UFOs or UAP are increasing dramatically. We're seeing more civilian-based projects, where we're trying to detect things like magnetic anomalies in the atmosphere overhead, or we're using artificial intelligence to identify known aerial objects and put a camera up there 24/7 to identify things that are not identifiable. So it's a little tougher with the water. And, keep in mind, there are 3 fundamental types of water where these objects are seen. Oceans, yes, but also lakes and rivers. So there's freshwater bodies as well. And it's very likely that we might have an easier time with some of the lakes and rivers than certainly with the ocean deeps, where that's a lot more difficult to do. But I could foresee maybe in this decade and moving forward, better use of civilian operated, remotely operated vehicles that have some kind of version of a kind of sonar that might be able to detect things. The problem with that is you would need, and presumably we would have algorithms that could identify a submarine or identify a whale or identify, other types of things that are in the ocean that would not be USOs. So it would take some doing, but I don't think it's impossible. I could imagine a group of interested oceanographers and maybe ex-Navy people who know the water very well and know the technology to be able to construct a civilian version of a detection station. It could happen. It could happen.
Final listener question from Russell. Russell says, I see Richard as a historian who has understandably been captivated by the UAP topic. Given that I and many feel we are past the point, a bit of a noise in the background there, sorry. Given that I and many feel we are past the point of no return in the disclosure journey, does Richard ever take the time to indulge in what the history books will document this period like in 100 years' time?
The last part. So have I ever indulged what my books will be like? How they will be seen in 100 years?
The way it's worded, does Richard ever take the time to indulge what the history books in 100 years will document this momentous period? I think there's a word missing there somewhere, yeah.
Well, whatever robot historians are at the top of their game in a century, I think they will be seeing the transformation of human civilization and the human species, not just disclosure. I'm a historian, but I love to put my little theories out there. I have all kinds of theories. I love to entertain them. One of them I call the 4th stage of humanity. I firmly believe this is real. So I think that the human species is going through a foundational transformation of what we are as a civilization, society, psychologically as a species. And we're moving from hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture to science and technology of the last couple of 100 years to now something new. And I think it's transforming us, where we are in a digitally ruled world of digital information that dominates, that will very likely be centrally controlled, I'm guessing. And it's going to make a lot of changes in our society. One of those changes will be a form of disclosure. So I think historians, human or otherwise, a century from now, are going to see this period of time as one that has initiated a absolutely foundational, dramatic transformation of our species. Whether for better or for worse, I can't say, but probably inexorable or inevitable. I do think that that's the case. We can't help ourselves. We're on this path Maybe since we discovered fire or discovered stone tools, started making those, maybe it goes back that early, that we've been on this path where we abstract our thought, we create a world of ideas independent of the reality. That's something, as far as I can tell, humans might be unique on this planet for that. And certainly constructing complex language and complex artificial conceptual structures, that's us. And once we've been on that path, I think we've taken ourselves onto a certain inevitability that is now leading to digital information and digital transformation of our world. So I think 100 years from now, that's what they're going to be looking back on. And they're going to see that something like disclosure would probably have been inevitable in this context. Because with the digitization of knowledge, the ability to share knowledge. I mean, look at this conversation you and I are having. We have an entire Atlantic Ocean between us, and yet we're doing it. That's because of the digital revolution. So that is allowing us to trade information, share information in a way that was just not conceivable before. And I think that was probably a prerequisite for disclosure. So I think future historians will see all of this is tied together pretty well.
And is it unfair to say, or fair to say, that in 100 years' time, books like yours, History of USOs, Volume 1, 2, and 3, perhaps there would be even more by that at that point, myself and yourself will be uploaded onto some cloud computer by then.
Oh, yeah.
People studying this period in time and perhaps studying a period just before disclosure, BD, not AD,
Yeah.
are looking at books like yours as an index, as a research tool to look at how we were understanding a phenomenon that was confusing, a time of upheaval, great change across the planet, in a way of understanding how we were and what we kind of become in that time. Is that what you kind of hope for books like these long term?
That's a great insight. And that's probably the best that I could hope for my books. Any historian ought to recognize that his or her work is never, almost never, let us say, going to be the final word, because we write history from the perspective that we have at the time that we have it, and history is always being revised and tweaked, and it should be, because it comes down to the questions that you ask. That's what creates your history, the questions that you put to the past, and people a century from now will undoubtedly have different and more pertinent questions in the future for them than we have today. We ask the pertinent questions that we have for today. So I think I cannot possibly expect that future centuries from now, they'll be looking at my books and thinking, oh yeah, this is the final word. But I would be very happy if future generations were to look at my books at all. First of all, that would be a shocker. But if they would, to look for, as you say, what were some of the people thinking about this phenomenon at the time? What were their best theories? And yeah, my book would be one that they would look at. They'd look at a bunch of others. And that would be an interesting thing to see. I'd love to be around to do a little H.G. Wells time travel, go into the future and see how all that works out. That would be a fun thing to know.
I honestly think in the next 5 to 10 years, books like yours and others and people's podcasts and documentaries and articles are going to be used by a wider public who are there now, who aren't quite there yet with the UFO topic, but they're going to have a whole wealth of knowledge to go over to start to understand something that perhaps is introduced to them, that they start to learn about in schools, academically, that science begins to study far more rigorously, and that the mainstream media pick up as the biggest story of all time. So I think there's a good chance of that as well.
What I want from this book that I've just published and the two other volumes that will come out this year, I want it to be easy to digest, which I think it is overall. I think it's one of those books where you don't have to read it cover to cover. You can actually skim and just dive into specific cases if you want. But I also did write it to provide the best foundation that I can into a way to understand this phenomenon, to give my best interpretation at this time of what this phenomenon might mean, not just from our point of view, but potentially from the point of view of these other beings. I haven't really ever before written from a hypothetical point of view of an alien, but I did at many points in this book, particularly in some of the introductory chapters. There's the introduction, and then there's each chapter has its own introduction where I try to provide context. And in that, I'm trying to frame this issue in a way that's easy to read, hopefully easy to understand and digest, because I'm thinking, yes, that the audience for this subject may expand in the coming years. And if there's people coming to this subject and they come across my book, I want it to be helpful. I want it to be something that people who know nothing about the subject can open up and read and say, oh, this was enlightening. This was helpful. That's what I want.
And I think it achieves that. I'll say as much. Richard, how can people get a hold of the book? What is the best way? And there are multiple different versions of it if you want to mention that as well.
Yeah. Well, it sells off of the Amazon platform, which is available in, most countries, I guess. It's the easiest way for me to get distribution of it. I can, in theory, get it in. I may get it into other platforms as well. I have that ability. I could do that, and I may do that. Currently, it exists in 3 formats: the hardcover, which is the most expensive cover version; paperback, which I just got here in the mail; and ebook. It will be available, I think, within 1 month from this conversation, in audiobook form as well. I have a very excellent professional audiobook reader working on this now. He's excited about the project. He wants to do this, and he's got a great track record, and we like him. So he's working on it, and it should be available soon. I could have waited on the publication of everything to have all 4 come out at the same time, and I just elected not to do that. But the audiobook will be out soon. So we'll be in 4 platforms, you could say. The hardcover is a bit expensive. It's the most pricey book I've ever published, but I just want people to know I have no control over that. Despite how expensive it is, my own personal royalty is very, very small. Amazon takes about 90% of that. That's the fact. So the printing costs, and then the printing costs were high, and then the distribution, they take, people don't realize this, but Amazon takes 60% of all the profits after production cost. So, I priced it as low as I could. The ebook is nice and cheap. It's $10, $9.99 US. Awesome. I try to keep that affordable.
Yeah, I've picked up the hardcover copy. I like hardcovers, and like you say, it is more pricey, but it's a very good quality hard copy. The pictures really pop out. The paper quality is even better as well.
They truly do. I'm during our conversation, I just saw this for the first time, and I'm tripping out a little bit here. I'm very, very pleased with the quality. The illustrations look fantastic, and everything else came out very, very nice. So I have no complaints.
Well, listen, in the week this interview is released, I'll be putting some clips out and selfishly trying to grow some of the social media feeds as much as I'm getting old and find these TikToks and Instagrams hard to use at times. If you can share and comment on any of the clips, I'm going to give away 2 copies of the book. I will pay for myself. People can pick any version of it. Please don't pick the hardcover, but if you do, that's fine. I'll give away 2 of those. So look out for any of these clips on social media platforms, folks. And I just want to finish with a thank you and shout out to Tracy, your wife, because she's been extremely helpful to me in getting these interviews put together last time and this time, Richard. And I'm sure you can give her a plug as well, because you do begin the book with a thank you to Tracy and an acknowledgement, and we can end the interview saying thank you to her as well.
Yeah, my wife is more than just my wife. She's my partner in every single thing that I do. She has been intimately engaged in this project with me from the beginning, providing feedback and ideas, many of which I implemented in this book, which made it better. But on the back end, she communicates with almost anyone who ever wants to reach me is usually going to have to go through her, because it's just not possible. I can't do the kind of correspondence that I wish I could. And I'm shocked that she's able to do even what she does. So she is truly my better half. And I thank the heavens that I have her with me.
Well, thank you, Tracy. And Richard, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, Andy, it's been a pleasure. And I look forward to the next time we come back on.